A warm welcome to this ICOM webinar on emergency management for museums with a focus on Lebanon. I'm Hannah Pennock and I will moderate this meeting. In these difficult times, many of us, due to the pandemic, are forced to stay home and work remotely. That gives us at the same time the opportunity to present speakers from the USA, Guatemala, Lebanon, Portugal, France, and Denmark. The meeting is hosted in Paris, and I'm speaking to you from my home in Utrecht, the Netherlands. And you, more than 80 participants, are tuned in from all over the world. This webinar is a co-production of ICOM Secretariat in Paris and 3 of its international committees. The IC for Disaster Resilience for Museums, the IC for Museum Security, and the Standing Committee for Disaster Risk Management, of which I am the chair. This is one of 4 ICOM webinars in the Capacity Building series, made possible thanks to the support of the French Ministry of Culture. This time we focus on emergency management. How can you prepare for an emergency in your museum? You know that you can prepare now already to avoid risks and make that they can't happen, to mitigate the effects once an emergency affects your museum. You can prepare now also for the aftercare. So you can prepare now for before, during, and after the disaster. In the next hour, we have 4 excellent speakers who I will introduce later. Samuel Franco Arce, Suzy Akimian, Marta Lourenço, and Elsa Ortiz-Ferreira. We have a welcome by Diana Pardue and a reflection on the presentations by Annette Hansen. Before we start, just a few practical remarks. Interpretation is available. You can choose your language, English, French, or Spanish, by clicking the globe at the bottom of your screen. Questions can be raised in the chat, and we will do our best to answer them during this session. And this webinar is being recorded. It will be available online afterwards. During the meeting, we will send an evaluation form in the chat. Please fill it out afterwards. And I will say that again because it's important. So first, now I introduce Diana Pardue for a short welcome on behalf of the International Committee for Disaster Resilience for Museums, of which she is the chair. Please, Diana.
Hello, I am welcoming you as the president of the International Committee on the Disaster Resilient Museums. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar on emergency management. The new International Committee on Disaster Resilient Museums, better known as ICOM DRMC, is one of the newest international committees created at the last ICOM triennial meeting in Kyoto in 2019. Its mission is to serve global museums as effective, inspiring, instrumental, and cooperative interdisciplinary museum committee dealing with emergency preparedness and disaster response. The immediate goals of the committee are to increase awareness about the importance of emergency planning and disaster risk management for museums within ICOM, to collaborate with other ICOM committees, regional alliances, and museum organizations in the field of cultural heritage emergencies and disaster response, and then to provide a mechanism in the museum community for the dissemination of information resources, training opportunities, and professional networking about disaster risk management. The DRMC works collaboratively with the Disaster Risk Management Standing Committee and the Department of Heritage Protection in the ICOM Secretariat to respond to museum emergencies with the appropriate communication, coordinated actions, and effective use of resources. This Beirut emergency response was the first example of this collaboration between these 3 groups. Finally, I would like to encourage ICOM members with an interest and experience in museum emergency preparedness and disaster response to join the DRMC as their international committee when they renew their membership for 2021. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diana. So to start, for a more theoretical and at the same time a very practical basis of risk management for museums and cultural heritage, I introduce our first speaker, Samuel Franco Arce. He is, among other things, the director of the Cultural Rescue Center in Antigua, Guatemala, and has extensive experience as a cultural first aider and trainer. Please, Samuel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hannah. Good day to everyone. My presentation, I'd just like to share the screen. You have to please allow me to share the screen. Okay. Okay, so my presentation, I would like to share some methodology, basically the methodology that I have used. I have been trained with this methodology as many other colleagues from the world. And also it is the methodology that we use in our training center. So basically, I'm going to go through the process of the risk management for cultural heritage before, during, and after, which in 10 minutes is quite a challenge, but I will try to do my best. We have the whole situation of the scenario of an emergency in this chart. So the before, this is the whole wheel of the process. We have the before stage in which we have to mitigate and prepare. This is the risk reduction phase. So this is the time when we do our planning. Then we have the during event phase, which we have to respond and apply the first aid. And then we have the after event stage where we do the recovery and rehabilitation. So before the event, we have this wheel that it will show us all the different stages that we have to go when we are doing our contingency plan. It is very important to be prepared. So first we have to analyze the context of our heritage, our museum, our institution, because every institution is different. So we have to do a tailor-made plan for our institution. Then once we have identified our, we have gone through the context, we identify the hazards, the agents of deterioration for those of conservation, which are familiar with the agents like ultraviolet light, water, pests, and so on. And then we have to identify the 6 layers or levels of enclosure, which are, for example, the object, the fixture, the furniture, the room, the building, the site, the region where our institution is. When we do our risk assessment, we have to consider all these levels. Then the 3 types of risk, where we evaluate, we identify whether it is a recurrent event, it is very rare, if it happens once a year, once every time of the century. This is the part of the identification. Then the next stage would be to analyze our heritage of how it will deteriorate. For example, if we have a textile exposed to ultraviolet light, there are formulas worked out by experts on conservation to define, the magnitude of risk. And also there are sources of information like scientific, technical, and also the community. The elders of the community know the things that scientifics do not know because they have lived there for many years. Then the evaluate stage would give us the level of priority. What do we have to mitigate? What do we have to work more, and the magnitude of risk of our object or our site. And then the treat stage. The treat stage, we use, we have the stages of control, which can be to avoid, to block, to to mitigate, whatever risk we have identified. So we have to treat it. And of course, we have to also treat the 6 layers or level of enclosure. If we're close to a river, if we're close to a highway or something, we have to think about those issues. And then the final phase on this wheel will be the monitoring stage, which is very important. You can do it periodically, monthly, weekly, daily, depends on the priority and the level of problems that you have. So evacuation, it's an activity that we can do before or after the event. For example, in the Caribbean, they know about, hurricanes are a hazard. So a hurricane can be announced maybe 4 or 5 days before it's coming. So you may have time to evacuate, your most valuable items of your museum, or if you have already a map of values, of your collection. So you assess, this is the workflow of the evacuation. You prepare, you document, pack and move, and relocate and store in a new temporary safe location. That is related to before the event. So now we're going during the event stage, which is almost post-event. There's this small difference, but during this cycle, there are 3 basic steps. One is the situation analysis of the emergency, the on-site damage and risk assessment, and the security and stabilization. And that will lead us to an early recovery. And throughout the whole process, there are these 3 elements that they are always present, which are documentation. You have to do continuous documentation, photographing, recording, risk management, because there are risks, secondary risk. Let's say that, for example, before deployment of experts, you have to secure the building, or before secure a wall, or an object that might be about to break or to be more damaged. It can happen every day. So it's a continuous process, as well as communication and coordination. Those are elements very important in the whole process of risk management. So on the situation analysis, we do collect data from different sources. As much data of the event. Then we analyze the data, and then we make our plan. Once we have analyzed the situation, we can choose the team of experts. If we need paper conservators, textile conservators, or audiovisual conservators, and what kind of equipment, personal protection equipment we need, and so on. So when we analyze the context, we also have to think, for example, if it's how was the event? Is it too critical? The context, the actors and local capacities that the region has, or the site, obtaining access and preparation for deployment. So the context of the emergency, the cultural heritage affected, and it is very important to identify stakeholders and actors. This is the stakeholders and actors map. If it's a private or a government institution, and then if we have foreign cultural heritage first aiders or institutions like Smithsonian can provide some help, or Blue Shield, a LEAF, there are many international institutions, ICCROM. Also the local, you have to find out who the local heritage organizations and professionals are, the local community, the religious board, the military, and then you have to analyze the level of influence and relationship that you have with those actors or stakeholders. Then the step 2 also goes on the on-site survey, where we do the initial damage assessment, the risk assessment, the initial risk assessment, the priorities for intervention. If it's a community, you have to consult with the community and do a consensus. And security and stabilization planning also is would be the next stage. So prepare, inspect the site, record damage and effects of the disaster, access and record immediate risk, compile and analyze data, prepare assessment report, and update for on-site actions. So we have also think about the hazards, which could be primary hazards or secondary hazards. You know, if there's an earthquake, it will have secondary hazards as fire, landslides, tsunamis, liquefaction. And here we have different examples. And now we have to include pandemics. You know, the pandemic, like COVID-19, has had an incredible impact on intangible cultural heritage, and it will keep on damaging, affecting intangible cultural heritage in the next years or months. So security and stabilization is the next stage, where we have to secure, triage in situ, if we have to secure the building, evacuate, salvage, triage, and temporary storage. And we have the temporary storage, which has to be a safe place. So this is the workflow for the the stabilization and security. First, permission, prepare, retrieve, triage, stabilize, pack and move, relocate, report, and monitor. These are different examples of how to secure a building with some shoring, or if you use belts, straps to secure, for example, a column. More about the workflow: permission, prepare, retrieve, pack and move, relocate, report. And then it is very important to have the registration for everything while you are evacuating, like a movement tracking form, the registration of the original location and the registration of the new temporary location. So finally, we have the recovery and rehabilitation stage, which includes post-first aid situation analysis, a condition assessment, like a post-disaster needs assessment, develop mechanisms for coordination, participation, and capacity building, evaluate the use, function, and meaning of cultural heritage, and you then gather resources. So this is basically the whole workflow of before, during, and after. And then this is all based on ICCROM and manual tools, which that's what I train and what we have been trained. We have this publication, which is the first aid to cultural heritage in times of crisis. We have translated to Spanish, and it's coming up next month. And it is in various languages at the ICCROM site. And also in this presentation, I have used some resources from the Guide to Risk Management of Cultural Heritage and Endangered Heritage Emergency Evacuation of Heritage Collections, which are also ICCROM publications. So thank you very much. And I hope this has been useful information in an express way.
Thank you very much, Samuel. This is a lot of information for people who really want to start with a risk assessment before anything even ever happens. You are a trainer, and you say there are many sources, many resources that you can consult on the internet, for example, the ones you showed from ICCROM. Is training really necessary, or can people do this just from paper?
No, training definitely it is necessary, and this is a challenge that we're facing now with this new era, in new life we have online, because practical exercises are very important. Simulations are a complementary, part of the whole methodology. Of course, theory, these manuals can be reference guides, but definitely we are finding out how we can do the practical exercises online. Like we are already experimenting, like having giving homeworks to our participants for the next session, so they can do some practical exercises at their own institutions and rehearse with forms and templates that are in these manuals.
Mm-hmm. Hey, and you mentioned the community twice, I think, at least, and we will come later with the presentation of Marta to speak about the added value of volunteers. So you say the community know things that scientists don't know. And the local community is also a stakeholder. So would you recommend that museums start now connecting with their community?
Definitely. I think this is more than ever the time to work with communities. I think this pandemic has brought us back to our roots in a way, you know, because first of all, we are not, the mobility is limited, you know, so people are more concentrated in their local regions now that we are locked down or confined to, and it is a great opportunity, you know, to rescue a lot of values that were being lost in this globalization and in all this new world. So I think this is quite a challenge for all museums to involve our community, to engage them, that they are the owners of this heritage, you know, to make them the owners of the collections or the heritage. So I would say, and also they are the ones who can advise us and guide us on how to proceed, because we are reading books, technical papers and so on, but nothing like real life and real knowledge from the old people that, you know, they know a lot of things. I think they are very, very resourceful. And now that we have all these technology tools, I think it's a very valuable way to complement both.
Thank you very much, Samuel Franco Arce. Participants, you can ask questions in the chat. Don't forget that one. And now I will move on to our next speaker, Suzy Akimian. She is curator at the Mineral Museum in Beirut and chair of ICOM Lebanon. She was ICOM's contact person after the devastating blast on August 4th, when the historical center of Beirut was severely damaged, including several museums. Suzy will focus on the heritage protection experience gained during the war and how this was helpful in reacting promptly to the explosion. She will speak in French. Please, Suzy, the floor is yours.
Bonsoir, bonsoir à tous. Merci à l'ICOM de me permettre de...
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Almost.
We see your screen,
but no PowerPoint. Yes, there you go. And if you can put it now on the large presentation.
Sharing it.
Go to the right down to the image of the big screen. That one. Yeah.
Okay. Is it okay?
Not yet. No, I still see your the work presentation.
No?
Yes,
there you are. Go ahead.
Okay. Donc, je voudrais remercier avant tout l'ICOM.
So first, I would like to thank the ICOM. I'm very happy to be here.
D'expliquer une situation.
And I thank you to give me the opportunity to explain the situation,
malheureusement double.
Which is very difficult for two reasons. First, because well, the Lebanon has gone through two very difficult experiences. First, in 1975, a war ravaged and destroyed the country and its institutions for more than 20 years. And the National Museum in Beirut remains an example of a miracle to preserved heritage and the resources that were used to preserve it. And so I would like to pay tribute to the memory of a monuments man in Lebanon, the Emir Maurice Shehab, who was very dedicated and took also very good decisions to save the National Museum. And here in my presentation, you see photos of the National Museum just after the war in 1991. So you see the facade, also the ceiling, the main door and the walls. Everything was impacted by shelling.
Presque total.
And so it's almost totally destroyed. And then inside, you can see the state of the situation of the place. You can see here what we call the sniper's hole. It's where militians came and barricaded themselves. And here they destroyed a mosaic. And they actually here they shot on the opponents from here.
L'eau est montée.
Also, there was water in the basement, as you can see here, and it damaged broken artifacts.
D'urgence qui avaient été prises.
So those were the emergency measures that were taken at the time
L'émir Maurice Chehab. Et cela,
by
je
the
voudrais
Emir Maurice Chehab.
place tout au long du conflit et on
And the measures were actually implemented all throughout the conflict and according to the type of aggression and its intensity.
avec
Here you can see, for example, that we covered objects with concrete and reinforced concrete.
suivi, si vous voulez, la situation de guerre.
So the safeguarding measures were following what happened with the war and the intensity of the conflict. And so on the 4th of August 2020 at 6:07 p.m. exactly, the blast in the port actually destroyed part of the city, houses, hospitals, cultural institutions, museums, schools, libraries, places of worship, and 8 museums were destroyed in a 10-kilometer radius, all the way to the northeast of the city. Windows and doors also were destroyed by the explosion as well, and some walls sometimes, and structures. They were like very considerable damage. And here you can see a very terrifying photo, which is in a hospital just after the explosion. The hospital was totally destroyed, and so the doctor is here outside trying to help a person, and they actually have only the light of their mobile phone. Here is another picture, which is the state of neighborhoods, schools, houses that are totally destroyed. And the windows, also the window frames were destroyed by the blast. Here we are inside the museum, the American Museum, the Prehistory Museum, the Susak Museum as well, or Wonders of the Sea. All those museums had more structural damage. And also the collections were damaged, but not so much, fortunately. So first aid was provided by the Blue Shield and also the ALIF and the ICOM, and I thank them very much. And so this first aid campaign was also with many volunteers that came from all around the country, and they helped in museums, in libraries, in places of worship and houses. And those volunteers were like sent directly on the ground, and they learned like the main safeguarding measures without any training. They were not even prepared psychologically before actually being there on the ground with and seeing all the damage and the devastation. So I really thank them with all my heart. And you can see that the measures, those measures were all only implemented after the blast. There were no preventive measure. And I will explain why later. But the problem is the problem in Lebanon with museums is not just did not start with the blast in Beirut, but since 2019, Lebanon has lots of problems with inflation, unemployment, liquidity crisis, and so the economic crisis actually has an effect. While the schools has to suspend school visits in museums. And this was very hard. It really had a strong impact on many museums. It limited their activity programs, and it also limited their revenue, because some museums actually rely on school visits for their revenues. And also the country has is seeing a very strong political crisis at the moment, and there's many demonstrations in the city. And barricades actually sometimes, so some streets are blocked, institutions are closed. And so this had also a very strong impact on cultural life, which depends on political stability. And then there was the pandemic in January 2020, which made things even worse. In March 2020, the government decreed a general lockdown. And so tourism actually was suspended. And the museums were, no one came and visit museums, and they had to close. And then the deconfinement measures were very much staggered, and museums only opened from mid-June again. and some actually never even opened because they were on university campuses. And some museums actually only open short term as well, because there was confinement, deconfinement, reconfinement again. And also, Lebanese museums do not have much resources. They are mostly private. They have to rely on their own financial resources, and they do not receive grants. And with the COVID crisis, well, their problems actually were only exacerbated. Some had to reduce their opening days, and others actually are even considering closing their doors. And so with the blast, well, it put an end to any possible recovery for museums. They were totally damaged. And on top of their operating expenses, they now have to rebuild. So how can we defend museums? Because it's what we're talking about today. Well, emergency plans generally list potential risks. And those risks can be natural disasters, for example, floodings, and also fires, or theft of collections, or administrative or political risks as well. And so the conflicts are also part of those risks, like collateral damage from armed conflict. There were terror attacks, bombings, hostage-taking in Beirut. And then there's also this list of risks has another tick box, which is other. And the blast in Beirut is actually part of this other category. And because of this, insurance companies have not actually paid any contribution or any compensation, sorry, to people or to institutions. And so was this blast foreseeable, and how can we protect ourselves against unpredictable risks? Well, to conclude, I would like to emphasize two things. First, the experience in Lebanon showed that people are really the cornerstone of all local initiatives and international initiatives to protect heritage. And so those experiences in Lebanon showed how important it was to have qualified human resources on the ground who can react quickly. And so that's why organizing trainings and workshops is one of the best means to build technical capacity for experts and staff in museum. And also generating awareness among staff and training them for main safeguarding measures is extremely necessary. It's very important for any emergency plan. And so the ICOM Lebanon Committee was very active in Beirut in the past few years. In 2007, it organized a seminar on managing the preventive conservation in museum, then the second seminar in 2009 on new practices, museographic practices, and then the last one in 2015 on emergency measures in Lebanon. And then the second thing I'd like to say as well is to everyone who works in museum that the cornerstone to safeguard any heritage is first of all to proceed to an inventory of collections and also to do a preventive conservation. Those are the prerequisites for the sustainability of heritage. And so I'd like to end with two notes. First, we need to integrate pandemics into emergency planning in museums. And also those emergency plans also must allow museums to actually recover and to pursue their mandate. And then I will finish on this last slide. That there is no zero risk. Never think that disaster will not strike your museum. And so you can have a safeguarding plan, and you must plan to safeguard your collection. And you also need to teach professional ethics and stop illegal traffic of heritage. And finally, we also need to preserve our planet, because the heritage will have no more utility when man will have destroyed the planet.
I hear that we have over 100 participants now. And again, feel free to ask questions in the chat if you have them, and do not hesitate. Susie, there was a lot of information in your presentation, and it goes from the bitter experience of war to the hard times of political and economical and financial problems, also for the museums. And then you had another disaster, this explosion, of which you said, how can you prepare for a disaster that you can't even imagine? I wonder, I asked you before about the resilience of you people over there. How does it work? Do people always stand up again, work for their museums? Can they manage? Can they do that?
Oui, c'est un mot, ce mot de résilience est un mot très dur, parce que nous l'avons vécu. Nous avons vécu la résilience durant 20 ans. Lorsque j'ai parlé de la guerre,
Resilience is a difficult word. I've talked about the war from 1991 to 2010. We have rebuilt our country, and then there was a kind of normal life, and resilience at that time was necessary to reconstruct our country. But today, frankly, many Lebanese people don't want to hear this word anymore, because resilience is not about reconstructing what others are constantly, deliberately, or almost deliberately destructing. That is fighting another intention. Resilience when there is a flooding or natural disaster, maybe, but today we want to resist. It's about resistance. It's not about resilience anymore. We want things to not to happen anymore.
For showing so clearly how it works in such a situation, and your presentation was very clear about that. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
I will move on to the
Thank you very much.
speaker, Marta Lourenço. She is the director of the National Museum of Natural History and Science of the University of Lisbon, and she is chair of UMAC, the IC for University Museums and Collections. And she has, Marta has experience in working with volunteers in emergency situations. What is their added value? Please, Marta, tell us.
Thank you so much, Hannah. I'm very touched by the, the simple way and sharp to the point that Susie made this presentation. And so thank you so much, ICOM, for the invitation. And also, this is a great panel so far, and I'm very happy to be here. Perhaps I should start by explaining briefly my connection and UMAC's connection with Beirut and the local volunteers. It's true that university museums all over the world work a lot with volunteers and young professionals. However, it was not the connection with universities that resulted in UMAC's engagement with the explosion in Beirut. That only came later. What I'm about to share with you is a story of how shock in tragedy, combined with anger, revolt, despair, shaped the initial response and drove a terrific group of young cultural heritage professionals to a state of incredible motivation, enthusiasm, and solidarity in the middle of the worst pandemic of recent times. It is also a story about citizenship and the power of grassroots networks, both real and digital, bringing people together to achieve wonderful things. In this sense, it's a very simple story, but one that is as old as humanity. In the very same day of the explosion, August the 4th, I reached out to the only person I knew in Beirut, a young architect and student called Gilbert Nicolas. Nicolas replied immediately, still in a great state of shock. He allowed me to share this exchange with you. 48 hours later, Gilbert was online, sharing photos and his first-hand experience of the impact on museums and historic buildings. With that first video, we initiated the UMAC Beirut series on YouTube. The series is still ongoing. Susie has been there. Thank you, Susie. There will be a video recorded with Peter Keller and also an open session with the volunteers later this month. At the time, 3 universities were confirmed as having museums, collections and libraries in the disaster zone. Saint Joseph University, the Université Libanaise, and the American University of Beirut. It was this that brought UMAC more directly into the center of what would become the international response, together with ICOM Paris, ICOM Lebanon, the Blue Shield, and so many others. Gilbert Nicolas, with 2 other young architects, David Shelala and Elsie Sayek, quickly realized that much help was needed and immediately started mobilizing friends and colleagues through social networks in articulation with professors, museum directors, and others. The dedication, professionalism, and generosity of these volunteers, especially at the very beginning when there were very few resources and the international coordination effort was not yet fully mobilized, is beyond anything I have encountered before in my museum professional career. When Elsa Ortiz Verea arrived in Beirut, 1 week more or less after the explosion, they were already pretty much organized and had assessment reports for her, lots of photos to show her, and even relevant ideas for a very preliminary reconstruction roadmap. Ultimately, a total of 64 volunteers were mobilized. Some were students, the majority were professionals from multiple areas. Since August, they have worked tirelessly, assessing and gathering information about the damages. 2 weeks after the explosion, they sent UMAC very detailed written reports with images and sketches on the impact of the explosion on each university. They have since been mediating contacts with rectors and university administrators. Today, they have been fully integrated in the national and international response, helping secure buildings, monuments, furniture, collections, and museums. The number of volunteers is now reduced to about 30. Their main challenges are, according to Gilbert Nicolas, again, 1 week ago, I asked him. The challenges are, beside the pandemic paralyzed some of our meetings, a severe financial, severe financial crisis in the country that forced young professionals to quit volunteering so that they can search for jobs or leave the country. The lack of materials and funds keep us from helping a larger number of buildings. The international community has always been here to help, encourage and push us in the best direction. However, the funding process is taking a lot of time and we are out of time because of the rain season. To conclude, 2 notes to conclude. The first is that I think there are certainly lessons to be learned, at least for me, from the volunteer experience in Beirut. I would highlight 3. Local volunteers are fundamental in first response. In general, locals are fundamental in first response. I think cultural heritage emergencies are complex and require multiple coordination fronts, as Samuel so well pointed out. But in the immediate aftermath of an explosion, an earthquake, a fire, you want people who know the site really well, ready to act, and you want them fast. So that's the first thing. Then the mixed teams of students and professionals. I think that the Beirut team is ideal in terms of volunteer composition. You do not want students only. You want them to mix with and benefit from, and later be supervised by professionals and emergency experts. My third lesson is effective integration in a larger team of emergency experts. This has also happened in Lebanon. the volunteers, albeit in fewer numbers, have been recognized and are fully integrated in the International Response Consortium. The second and final note, each emergency is very different in its local dimensions, its impact, and especially in the way it touches the hearts of local and international communities. Tragedies, disasters, accidents, wars, unfortunately, happen all the time, in the present as in the past. Some tragedies happen silently, away from the limelight of international media. Others mobilize empathy and solidarity at global scale, such was the case of the 2018 fire at the National Museum in Brazil, or the 2019 fire in Notre Dame in Paris, and it was also the case of Beirut. Certainly, the Beirut explosion has its own specificities, and for me, perhaps the most salient is a certain sense of social malaise and disbelief that the Lebanese state, the government, has the capacity or will to act promptly and meaningfully. This was and is, in my view, a very powerful drive for social empowerment and change and active citizenship in Lebanon. In the particular case of the volunteers, I think it was the main factor between their extraordinary bottom-up mobilization before the emergency. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marta, Lorenzo. You are talking about a mighty force of young people coming right away in action after the explosion, after the disaster. And this was a very specific combination, I think, of people, like with 30 architects, which is exactly what you might need in that moment. And the archaeologists and interior designers and mechanical engineers, and young people. Usually we think of, at least in my country, we think of volunteers as retired people who have finally time to go and work in the museum and help, etc. So would you say that museums should train their volunteers or prepare their volunteers already now? Or would you say maybe we better wait when something happens for this spontaneous group of young people who come and give a hand?
Well, I think that's a very good question. I think that there's two things. There is a very special combination. There was a very special combination in Beirut, okay? So this atmosphere, this angst, political, economical, social, and so on, that has been going on, especially since last year, resulted, plus the fact that they were architects and very dedicated and so on, I think resulted in this fantastic enthusiasm and mobilization. But I agree that, you know, in a museum like mine, we have more the young type, so to speak, the young type of volunteers than the older expert type. We have both, but we have more the young, perhaps because it's a university museum, so we have a lot of students. But the benefit, I usually say that for senior volunteers, the benefit is more for us, the museums. But in the case of the junior volunteers, the benefit is more for them. And so we contribute to train future professionals, who knows, maybe not, but who knows. So I think there's this double side of the coin.
Yeah, well, the experience will certainly be helpful at another moment, I'm sure. Thank you. So I would like to go over to our fourth presentation of Elsa Urtis-Ferrea, because she went to Lebanon right after the explosion. And when ICOM was able to provide immediate support, thanks to the emergency response protocol that we just had elaborated really like 3 days before we had our concept ready. And then we already could put it into practice. So Elsa Urtis-Ferrea, she is the Heritage Protection Coordinator at ICOM Secretariat in Paris. She contacted local and international partners and went to Lebanon twice. She now presents a report of her mission on the collaboration with other parties and the future role of ICOM in this respect. Please, Elsa.
Thank you, Anna. I will share my screen and turn off my camera because my Wi-Fi is not stable. So I think the sound will be better. Here we go. So before we start, I just would like to go back to what, so I'm just trying to do two things at the time and I'm not good for that. So I'll just turn off my camera if I can. Oh, so before I start, I would just like to come back to Susie and Marta's intervention, because I think that I believe the strength of ICOM is, and our modest participation in the ICOM Secretariat was only possible thanks to that commitment and the involvement of so many of the network and so many volunteers. So I will come back to the stages of our commitment at the Secretariat to the museums of Beirut. But before that, I'll just like to maybe, before I do so, I will say a word on the way we operate. So ICOM, which has its headquarters in Paris, is, as we know, a network of museum professionals. And we almost have 40,000 professional members in the world with 123 national committee around the world, standing committees, as you said, international committees and working groups. And so to come back to the subjects that interests us today, we have within the Secretariat based in Paris, a department dedicated to heritage protection. And we have the DRMC Standing Committee, chaired by you, Hannah, and your moderator. We have an international committee dedicated to museums safety issues, and Annette would say a word at the end of our webinar. And we also have, so this is ICMS, this is the acronym. And we have the International Committee working on Museums and University Collection, UMAC. And we have, as Diana mentioned, the brand new International Committee for Disaster Resilient Museums. So our role within the Secretariat was here to support our national committee, ICOM Lebanon, and to inform our network and our partner about the damages and the help to coordinate as we could that help needed there in Beirut. In terms of prevention, just before going back to my report, we also have, sorry, before talking about Beirut specifically, we are carrying out various projects. And for instance, here, I put the news about 5 projects that are financially supported by ALIF in West and Central Africa. It's being coordinating here in the Secretariat. And those projects are, for instance, to update inventories or to digitalize collection, which is, as Susie mentioned, extremely important, Samuel as well, in terms of prevention. As for Beirut, in coordination with the mentioned committees and in close collaboration with Susie, with ICOM Lebanon, we organized the first mission 4 days after the explosion. And accompanied by Susie, we were able to visit the severely affected museums. And the aim was to have an overall view and a kind of first damage assessments, thanks to the volunteers, as Marta said, to meet the museum directors, of course, and our partner and the General Directorate of Antiquities, Blue Shield Lebanon as well, in order to act the best way possible. And as soon as this mission was carried out, we reported the extent of the damage to ALIF, whom we had notably published a declaration. I put here as well screenshot of our website, and it's still available if you want to read it. A declaration of solidarity with 25 other partners. And it seemed obvious to us quite quickly that the need was not in terms of expertise, but was in terms of coordination and money. So thanks to the responsiveness of Alif, we was already committed $5 million for the rehabilitations of Beirut's heritage, not only for museums, but partly to museums. Many projects have been launched already or in the process of being launched. And that was the subject of the second mission we did with our Director General, ICOM and Alif in Beirut in September. So I will start now talking about the museum more specifically. So this is the Museum of Archaeology of the American University of Beirut, directed by Nadine Panayot. So the museum building was damaged. The doors and windows were blown up, which was the case of almost every museums. But the most worrying was this display case containing 74 glass objects, archaeological objects. And as you can see here, the display case fall completely over on the ground. So thanks to the financial support of Alif and a good coordination, a specialized restorer from the INP, which is the National Institute of French Heritage, come in Beirut in the museum and worked with the museum's teams to collect and secure all the sometimes barely visible fragment that you can see over here. So this is a mix between the window case and the objects. And the next step will be their restoration for those who are not lost forever. So here you have the images after, with all the fragments of glasses classified with all the objects that they could identify. And now the museum, as for the building, all doors and windows have been replaced by the direction of the museum. Here it's the Prehistory Museum, directed by Maya Bustani. Luckily, the collection has not been touched. However, as you can see in these pictures, the building has been badly damaged. So it's on one of the campus of the San Joseph University. First, the initial help has been provided by Blue Shield Lebanon to cover up the roof. Here you can see that there is a roof ceiling. So that has been covered quite quickly thanks to Blue Shield. And now an agreement is in progress with Alif, and the work should start quite soon. I put that picture here of the door because this is very important. That doesn't seem damaged, but actually the story is that Maya Bustani, the director, has it installed very shortly before the explosion, maybe a few weeks before, because of the electric atmosphere in the streets and the scared of maybe the misbehavior possible in the city because of all the demonstration at that time. And as the museum is close to the center, in order to prevent any possible misbehavior or overflow that could endanger the museum, she had this element hastily added. And thanks to that extra doors, you can see here, that's the glass door just behind it. Of course, it's damaged, but I think that we think that the collection was preserved thanks to that new door. Here is the National Museum. Suzy talked about it. So the National Museum is managed by the General Directorate of Antiquities. And the Louvre and Alif joined forces to the DGA to carry out the repair work. So that's also ongoing. Maybe Suzy has more information. And the collection has not been affected either, but windows and doors, I don't know if we can see here, but has been completely blown up. And this is the Sursock Museum before. This is the Sursock Museum after. It's directed by Zeina Arida. It's the only museum of modern art of the country, and by far the most affected museum. You have probably all seen these images that have been sadly traveled around the world. Fortunately, few works were damaged compared to the violence of the explosion. if I'm not mistaken, there is 26 works on paper, and they are therefore really fragile. And in addition of a work on Canva of Van Dungan. And sadly, it's the portrait of Nicolas Sorsok, the first owner of the building, and a sculpture damaged as well. The building was extremely damaged, as you can see. Thanks to the support of Alif, the work has begun. It's in this museum that we organized the press conference, the joint press conference with Alif and ICOMOS to announce the aid provided this September. And it's important to note that for what we are interested in, if we have listened to learn, that museum has reopened in 2015 after years of very important renovation and extension work led by the architects Jean-Michel Villemotte and Jacques Abou Khaled. And museum director Zeina Arida confided that to us that without these renovation works, the museum would probably have collapsed completely. The same is true of the National Museum, by the way, also renovated by Jean-Michel Villemotte partly, who gave it a basement and solid showcases that have prevented the collection. So that's for the overview of the role of ICOM for the museums in Beirut. Obviously, and we often talk about it with Susie, the hardest part is yet to come, and the complete rehabilitation of museums will be very long. And the project now must be thought in terms of education and public. Thank you.
Thank you, Elsa. In the meantime, I have received 2 questions, and I think one I can ask to you, Elsa. Mm-hmm. It's Andrea Kieskamp from ICOM Netherlands. And she asked, could you please tell more about the organization of tasks after the blast? Several organizations and volunteers have helped, but who was responsible for the general coordination? I imagine this can potentially represent a challenge, she says. Maybe you can answer it, or otherwise, Susie. Elsa, first.
Do you want me to start, Susie? And then that's an excellent question, because that's true. That was it's a kind of issue. We built a kind of task force with Alif and ICOMOS trying to coordinate that. But there is 2 things. First, there is the help provided to museums and the volunteers, and Gilbert Nicolas, who Marta talked to us about. It's very interesting because they are working for museums to help museums, the historical buildings, and then private houses. A lot of stuff. I mean, heritage in general, it's very large. So it's not talking just about museums. And they are working for every NGO, and volunteers on the ground are mostly working for every institution they can help or private houses. So that's the first thing. And then we also have Blue Shield, which has been created by ICOM, ICOMOS, IFLA, and ICA. So that's a kind of coordination as well. But coordinating on the ground is a real issue because they sometimes see other NGO working on the same subject. So there is a lot of, on a daily basis, of work to do on coordination. Susie, you might want to complete what I've...
Yeah, it's something, I will come back to Susie later. I have another question for Susie. But first, Elsa, well, thank you for your presentation, because this is what ICOM hopes to be able to do also in the future, help museums after an emergency or a disaster. And the worldwide network of museums and museum professionals is there to support each other in difficult times. And that was what we are working on together, all of us in the security and safety area of ICOM, so to say. I would like to ask Susie, maybe do you have anything to add to what Elsa was now saying about the collaboration and about who is who does the general coordination? Otherwise, I have another question for you, Susie.
Effectivement, le problème que Elsa a soulevé est un des problèmes du Liban.
Yes, there is a problem that the coordination is really a problem.
initiatives.
So we need initiative. People have initiatives on the ground, and they have to be coordinated. What I'm satisfied with when it comes to the museum is that the ICOM Lebanon was here.
Une sorte de chapeau.
And so all the cultural institutions that can really unite the different partners together to deal with problems, to find solutions, when all this function, all this works, and that's why the ICOM is working. I'll give an example. For example, the ICOM does not have any national committee when it comes to restoration. Yeah, ICOM doesn't, but the ICOM has. So we have all those groups, institutions that allowed to help with coordination and have a good coordination. It wasn't the case for other cultural sectors. For example, art galleries, we do not have really an overarching organization that can help them work in the same direction and coordinate. Because if you don't coordinate, then you work in the wrong direction.
It's always a challenge indeed. I have one other question for you, Suzy. Vincent Michel from ICOM France, he asks, could you please tell us if there was any theft of cultural goods during the crisis in museums of Lebanon?
Merci mon Dieu, 100 fois.
No, thank God, really, thank God we avoided this. We were very quickly on the ground and we shut the doors of all institutions. And that's why we get this impression that we're always running after or running behind doors and windows, but it was to avoid any theft and degradation of heritage. So fortunately, there were no theft at all, whether in museums or in libraries. Or maybe there was a danger here with private houses, but it is not our direct responsibility. When it comes to museums, fortunately, thank God, there was not even any vandalism act or no thefts.
Risks that Samuel was talking about. Something happens and then many other things can happen after the disaster, after the disaster. Well, if you participants don't have any other questions, please go ahead still. I would like to move on to Annette Hansen to give a reflection on what we have heard. Annette Hansen is the Director of Facilities and Security at Louisiana Museum of Modern Art in Denmark. And she is the chair of ICMS, the International Committee for Museum Security. So please, Annette, let us hear your short reflection on what our colleagues have just presented.
Thank you, Hannah. And I know we are running out of time, so I will keep it short. But first of all, I really want to thank the 4 speakers for this afternoon. It has been really interesting to hear about this very new affection in Lebanon. And what I'm hearing about most of it is that it's how important it is with a commitment and involvement in a strong network like ICOM. And especially to know who to contact when something happened, and how important kind of the first analyzing of the situation is, that to prepare the right needs for who to go, where to go. Is it, as I said, expertise, or is it financial supporting? Is it bringing in volunteers? Is to have the good social networking about. And I guess that's one of the things we are missing, and why every third of year when we go together across the commitments that we meet and meet people from other countries. I also hear that there's work to do on coordination between different kind of organization. It can be local, national, and international. That we can definitely, even in this group, be better in working together and helping each other coordinate. And another thing that I hear you mention all the time, and kind of a mantra for ICMS, is to be prepared. Really be sure that you have made your analysis of all the threats and risks of the museum, in the museum, around the museum, And a very good example is the one that Ilse has mentioned, is that you make a risk analysis for the situation in the street. So you put in a more safety door, front door, and it helps actually to, in a situation like this, that it might save a lot of the collection. Another thing is being prepared in that you take the maintenance of the building seriously. That was the Susuk Museum and the National Museum, that because they were renovated newly, that they actually were standing after this explosion. And that's another thing that we are working with in ICMS, is that this risk analyzing or having a look over the security or the construction and something like that, we are also 280 specialized in matter of that, in their renovation, security alarms and things like that. And we will really like to help you if you need us. And we do a lot of workshop as well, training staff in doing whatever it needs to be done, making emergency plans and stuff like that. We have in ICMS also published our handbook on emergency produce. You can find it on our website, and it's in English, translated also to French, Spanish, Chinese, and Armenian, I hear. It's not on the website yet, but I would definitely be sure that we put it on surely. So, and yeah, like, oh, in the end, I would just say, make sure that you put your security organization also as a fundamental and integrated part of the total organization of your museum. It's not a secure issue alone. So thank you, Hannah.
Thank you very much, Annette Hansen. So it's very good that you stressed too, we have so many professionals within ICOM who are really ready to help and organize workshops and organize meetings and come and give advice if you want. So let's please stress that and remember that. I thought we would finish about after 5 o'clock, but there are actually 2 more interesting questions, and I hope you participants still have some time for these ones. And I will give these 2 questions as last, and then we will conclude. I think the first one is a good one for Samuel. The question comes from Patayaone Sigacho from ICOM Botswana. And the question is, what strategies are in place to document and preserve the pictures, the photos, and the information captured about the crisis in the museum? So actually the question is about how do you archive the documentation you made during the crisis, and what can you do with that? Samuel, maybe you can reflect on that.
Yes. Well, definitely you have to have backups, since now we're talking about digital data. We have to have one of the rules of documentation on audiovisual content, like photos and recordings. And it's like we should have 3 backups at least. So you can have your backup, one at your museum and another one somewhere else. But one is in the cloud, for example, and also one important is to have another backup somewhere in a different geographical area, because maybe you have all this information in an area that it might be affected by a secondary hazard. So you want to be sure that you keep this data, and then the idea is to analyze this data, to process with the experts, because of course there will be a lot of different subjects compiled. So you will have to contact the specific person that that knows about the subject of this particular data. Let's say if it's a structural engineer, if it's a matter of a building, or a conservator of textiles or paper, or So that's what you do with your data. But it is very important to because that's in the recovery period. You in the early recovery period is when you analyze all this data and you make sure that these things won't happen again, or at least if there's a second event like this, you will be more prepared based upon all these experiences and data that you have collected.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, we should learn as much as possible every time, more and more, again and again. Okay, thank you, Samuel. And then there's another question from Alexandre Chevalier from ICOM Belgium. And he asks, somebody mentioned a document on emergency procedures prepared just a couple of days before the Beirut blast. Is such a document available somewhere? And I think I can answer this question, Alexander. I think you mean that we within ICOM, we developed a protocol with the Standing Committee, with the International Committee, and with the ICOM Secretariat, a protocol on what can ICOM do when a disaster happens. And in this protocol, we describe, it was still a concept at that time. And in this protocol, we described what can we do to get information, from whom, and when will we come into action. For example, we only want to go anywhere if there is really an expression of need. We won't go and impose ourselves, of course. So that is what Elsa immediately started to find out after the blast, contacting ICOM Lebanon, contacting other connections, always ICOM members, to get the information, to hear about the needs. And from that point on, we go and see what can we do, where can we work together with other parties like Blue Shield, like Alif, and then how can we help to mitigate the damage afterwards. You know, once I heard here in the Netherlands, there was an enormous flooding of an archive, which was in a cellar, a good storage, but down below. And so this, the curator talked about it as a honeymoon. In the first days, the first weeks, everybody is full of adrenaline and ready to act and to help and to work on. But then after like 6 or 7 weeks, and the insurance won't respond, and it takes a long time before you can do anything. And maybe in that second phase, actually after the first weeks, maybe ICOM can then help connecting museums who can help in restoring, etc., conservation works, etc. So Alexandre Chevalier, that was the protocol we were talking about, and it's still going to be rather further refined, and it will be our working method to act as ICOM after a disaster happened that affected museums as well. So, dear participants, dear speakers, I think we are going to conclude this this wonderful webinar. I think personally, I think it was very interesting, and I thank the speakers very much for their wonderful presentations and all the preparation work they did for that. Thank you in Paris, Ludovica Antonucci, Isa Demdami, Alessandro Gaballo, Elsa Ortiz Verea, and Carlos Serrano for facilitating this webinar. Thank you, interpreters, for making the presentations available for ICOM, in ICOM's 3 languages. And thank you to you all for participating in this webinar. Please, 2 more things. The next and the last webinar in this series will take place on 18 November and will be about stimulating employment in museums. And last thing, please fill out the evaluation form. You can just copy paste the link that is in the chat because it really helps us to know what you think of this kind of webinars and how we can improve. So, dear all, thank you very much for attending. And unfortunately, I cannot see you, so it's a very abstract wish. Have a good day, have a good evening, and thank you very much. Goodbye.